Switching gears from conversation about your demise to Western civilizations, we have to span the globe with all of the hot spots that the Trump administration is having to address, from sanctions against Russia to sanctions against Venezuelan dictator Maduro
Yeah, and this
to,
morning they arrested 2 opposition leaders, grabbed them in the middle of the night and took them out.
but it's better than the murdering them in the streets that they were doing earlier over the weekend, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, obviously you have just civil disintegration in Venezuela. The Venezuelan miracle. That's Salon.com. David Soroka and Salon.com was just writing a few years ago. The Venezuelan economic miracle. Bernie Sanders. That's the Bernie Sanders model over there. Take a good hard look. Mike Pence in the Baltic states talking about Russia as well, with the presidents of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And then, of course, the threat that North Korea poses with their ongoing missile tests. And no one better to help us make sense of it all, the threats and the opportunities, than our friend Michael Rubin, of course, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, author of a number of books, including Dancing with the Devil and Kurdistan Rising, former Pentagon official. Michael Rubin, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan.
So, whoa, gosh, where should we start? How about Russian sanctions? Now that the mooch is gone and his silliness with him, we're back to, I think, where we started at a week ago, which is President Trump is going to sign the Russian sanctions bill that was put on his desk with overwhelming bipartisan congressional majorities support in tow. And Putin has responded by expelling hundreds of diplomatic staff and suggesting he's going to seize embassy property in Russia. You had Pence in the Baltics yesterday talking about the unpredictability of Russia and that America stands with the Baltic states as well as our EU and NATO allies. Give us your handle on where, forgetting the Russian collusion business, the geopolitical national security matter between Russia and America stands.
Well, the sanctions date back not only to the allegations of Russian interference in the U.S. elections, but also to the fact that they had invaded the Ukraine, and they annexed Crimea, which even the Russian government, before Vladimir Putin, recognized as Ukrainian territory. It means absolutely nothing to say that there's ethnic Russians there, because, there's ethnic Russians everywhere. We wouldn't want Russia invading Brighton Beach in New York City.
Right.
Now, the sanctions, which were passed overwhelmingly, so honestly it doesn't matter whether President Trump signs them or not, because they would become law anyway.
Optically, though, it does.
Oh, optically, of course it does. But in this case, they sanction Russian energy firms, and they basically upped the sanctions that were already in place with regard to Russian actions in the Ukraine, among other places. Now, Russia responded, as you said, by saying that the United States needs to cut more than 700, I think it was 755 diplomatic staff, and that includes not only American diplomats, that also includes the Russians answering the phones at the American embassies and consulates and so forth. Now, what I would basically argue is, fine, Russia's coming up with this number in order to have parity, but if Russia wants parity, let's keep in mind that they have more consulates in the United States than we have consulates in Russia. So maybe it's time that the Russians close either San Francisco or Seattle, because also, let's be frank, Dan and Amy, they only use those consulates for industrial espionage anyway against Silicon Valley and our high-tech computer outlets up in the Seattle area. The other thing we could do is say, fine, we're going to continue doing the business that America needs to do with regard to our diplomatic interests, but if we've got to cut people, then we're going to cut the staff that have been issuing Russians visas, Russian oligarchs' kids and so forth, visas to come to Disneyland. I mean, there's ways to do this where it simply doesn't hurt as much as perhaps Vladimir Putin thinks it will hurt.
Well, should our rhetoric become a little bit more bellicose, or maybe a better way to say this, should we have the president and the vice president speaking with moral clarity on the topic? Mike Pence yesterday, even while offering that statement of support for our allies in the Baltics and the EU and NATO, also say, we want better relations with Russia. We want to improve our relations all the time. Now, of course, nobody wants to be saber rattling for war, but I just go back to Reagan characterizing the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Do we need some bright lines drawn by this administration?
Well, Mike Pence has been doing a great job of actually getting the balance right. It's important to recognize that and for Russia to recognize that we're going to stand up for our allies. I mean, there's an old Onion article, that satirical newspaper, that has Condoleezza Rice lecturing, warning American allies not to border Russia. That's not what our foreign policy should be in the real world. The fact of the matter is, we need to make clear to the Russians that we are going to stand by NATO members, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they can't encroach on them the way they've been encroaching on Ukraine or Georgia. It's in our interest, for the sake of peace, to make sure that Russia does know where that red line is. We don't want to be careless with the idea of red lines or simply abandon them the way that the President Obama did in Syria, because in such a case that could actually encourage more bellicosity on the part of Russia. But you're absolutely right. We should be extending that olive branch, saying that we're acting a certain way in reaction to what you are. We've got to stop self-flagellating and recognize the problem isn't Washington, it's the Kremlin.
So do you think if we move over now to North Korea, should there be some rhetoric between President Trump and Kim Jong-un? Is that a possibility, or how do you think that this, now, because on Friday they launched another ICBM that we've learned could reach the lower 48 states. So what are we doing? What is Trump doing to protect us and the American citizens?
Well, Amy, first of all, when it comes to rhetoric, I mean, it's a daily staple of North Korea to just have the most bombastic rhetoric out there. I've always been surprised that people then get so shocked if the United States responds in kind, because after all, if North Korea is doing it every day, it really doesn't kill anyone for the United States to basically say, we're not going to be pushovers in whatever style we do it. You can't simply scare us into shaking loose another $1 billion, which has been the policy ever since the Clinton administration. Now, what we are doing is putting more military assets in the region. For example, carrier strike groups, long-range bombers. We have been shoring up South Korean defenses with anti-missile systems, the way that Israel has anti-missile systems to protect against the rockets that come in from Gaza. The real weakness, if you will, or the vulnerability of South Korea is that Seoul, the capital, has millions of people. It looks like Chicago. It's a very modern city. Is within range of North Korean artillery on three sides, which means North Korea can wreak havoc just by lobbing shells at it. Now, what we're also worried, and the reason we're worried, is that more than a quarter century of diplomacy hasn't seemed to curtail North Korea's weapons program, and now people either say that North Korean nuclear weapons can hit Hawaii and Alaska. That's the good scenario, or half the United States, and that's what we need to worry about. There's a tendency in the United States very quickly to breathe a sigh of relief every time there's a failed missile test on the part of North Korea, Iran, or any one of our other adversaries. This politics of procrastination doesn't work because scientists can learn just as much from a failed test as from a successful test.
Well, then what should be done? South Korea clamoring for nukes of their own.
Well, after that's the nightmare scenario, or perhaps not such a nightmare scenario, simply because South Korea is starting to take its defense in its own hands. Now, no one wants proliferation, but the fact of the matter is, we wouldn't have this proliferation if it weren't for the persistent threat from North Korea. Now, where Donald Trump has come in is to question whether we should be continuing with the policies which have arguably led us astray over the last quarter century, and that is working through China to try to bring North Korea to heel. On paper, it makes perfect sense, but again, if you look over the past 25 years, it simply hasn't worked. We've given China tremendous benefits. We've waived licenses and such on dual-use technology just to get China to play ball in North Korea. And instead of playing ball productively, Dan, it looks like China, Beijing, has been playing good cop, bad cop, taking what they can from us while telling North Korea with a nod and a wink to go ahead. That's what Donald Trump is reacting against when he says how disappointed he is in China.
Well, right, and there's no dealing with the spawn of a man who said he shot 18, or he said he shot. I think he said he had 11 holes in one in his first round of golf. Kim Jong-il.
Oh, please.
I mean, there's no diplomatic path for somebody that speaks about golf in that way.
I mean, well, this is a country where his greatest enemies commit suicide with 3 shots to the head.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, they really wanted to commit suicide. Switching over to our hemisphere and South America and Venezuela, sanctions imposed on the bus driver dictator in charge of what used to be Venezuela. Where does that go? What exactly are our interests in Venezuela other than humanitarian?
Well, first of all, let's take a step back for a second. It's important to recognize that just a couple decades ago, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America, and every single high school student and college student who goes around wearing Che Guevara T-shirts and so forth should look at Venezuela and recognize this is what socialism does. It takes countries and it ruins them. People are getting shot in the streets. So a lot of this has to do with human rights, but Venezuela has increasingly been supporting terrorist groups. It's been supporting groups that destabilize others. It's been working with Iran. It's been working with Palestinian terrorists like Hamas. And we don't want it destabilizing countries which have really turned themselves around, like Colombia.
Well, but do you think we'll have sanctions against Venezuela?
Well, we have the
sanctions.
We put on sanctions with regard to the leadership of Venezuela. And, a lot of people have been saying, why is the United States standing aside as things get so bad? Just one thing, Dan and Amy. I mean, people always talk about climate change and so forth, and they always talk about drought. What many people forget is the difference between drought and famine is drought is weather-made, where famine is man-made, usually by poor governance. And what we're seeing now, Venezuela has gotten so bad that there's actually a chance of famine, that there's people starving in the streets in Venezuela simply because the government has become so dysfunctional.
He is Michael Rubin, resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute, author of a number of books, including Dancing with the Devil and Kurdistan Rising. Michael, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect